Experts couldn't repair a complex ship engine until the Admiral brought a brilliant Marine veteran. Welcome to Dust Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The USS Intrepid, the crown jewel of the United States Navy, was a ghost. Adrift in the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific, it was a multi-billion-dollar monument to silence. For 17 days, the most advanced warship ever built had been dead in the water. Its revolutionary electromagnetic propulsion system, a marvel of quantum engineering and theoretical physics, inexplicably inert. The ship, designed to be the apex of naval power, a silent hunter capable of circumnavigating the globe without refueling, couldn't even power its own coffee makers. On board, in the sterile, chilled confines of the main engineering control room, a palpable despair had taken root, a toxic vine strangling the hope of the world's most brilliant minds. Teams of PhDs from the defense contractor, top naval engineers, and software architect from Silicon Valley had swarmed the vessel, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of screens flashing endless error codes. They had run terabytes of diagnostic simulations, cross-referenced every line of code, and scanned every microscopic filament of the engine's core. Yet they were no closer to an answer than they were on day one. The engine, a fusion of technologies so advanced it bordered on science fiction, remained a perfect, unsolvable puzzle. The silence from the engine room was more than a lack of noise. It was a deafening proclamation of failure, a failure that echoed all the way to the Pentagon. There, in a soundproofed office, Admiral Jonathan Hayes stared at a satellite image of his crippled command, the lines on his face etched deeper with every passing hour. The Intrepid wasn't just a ship. It was a statement of American technological supremacy. Its failure was a national security crisis, a profound, public humiliation that threatened to unravel careers, starting with his own. The pressure from Washington was immense, a crushing weight of frantic phone calls and classified briefings. The corporate contractor, led by the prodigy Dr. Alastair Finch, had promised a solution within 48 hours. That was 15 days ago. Now, Finch and his team of wunderkinds were offering only excuses, couched in impenetrable jargon about quantum decoherence and recursive software loops. They were brilliant, they were pedigreed, but they were utterly, comprehensively stumped. Hayes, a man who had built his career on decisive action, felt the bitter taste of impotence. He had followed the protocol, trusted the experts, deferred to the men with the doctorates and the patents. And they had failed him. As the 17th day bled into night, a forgotten memory surfaced in the Admiral's mind, a relic from a different era, a different kind of Navy. It was the face of a man, not a scientist, not an engineer in the traditional sense, but a master of machines, a man who understood the soul of an engine not through a computer screen, but through the palms of his hands. A man the system had long since discarded as an anachronism. In a moment of pure, career-betting desperation, Admiral Hayes picked up a secure phone. He bypassed the chain of command, the panels of experts, and the corporate liaisons. He called his aide, his voice low and firm, imbued with a final, desperate authority. "Get me Master Gunnery, Sergeant Marcus Thorne. Find him. I don't care if he's fishing in Montana or retired in a swamp. Get him on a plane. Now." The aide, stunned into silence, simply whispered, "Sir." Hayes's voice was as cold and hard as steel. "You heard me. The experts have failed. It's time to call a mechanic." The decision was a monumental gamble, a rejection of the entire high-tech, corporate-driven military-industrial complex. It was an act of faith in a forgotten kind of wisdom, and it would either be the move that saved the Navy's most precious asset or the final, spectacular act of a once-storied career. The ghost ship waited, its fate now resting not on the world's most advanced minds, but on the instincts of one retired Marine. The antagonist in this high-stakes drama of man versus machine was not a foreign power, but a man of immense, almost blinding intellect, Dr. Alastair Finch. At 34, Finch was the lead architect of the Intrepid's propulsion system, a wunderkind who had graduated from MIT at 19 and was now the golden boy of the defense industry. He moved with an aura of unshakable self-assurance, his custom-tailored suits a stark contrast to the drab naval uniforms surrounding him. To Finch, the engine was not a machine. It was a symphony, and he was its sole composer. The idea that it could fail was a personal affront, a discordant note in the perfect melody of his own genius. His approach to the problem was purely academic. He and his team, a hand-picked cadre of young, brilliant theorists who spoke the same rarefied language of quantum physics, locked themselves in the ship's main briefing room, which they had converted into a war room. The walls were covered in white boards filled with labyrinthine equations. They ran complex simulations on supercomputers flown in from headquarters, creating digital twins of the engine and subjecting them to every conceivable variable. They argued about Fermion fields and temporal logic, their debates esoteric and impenetrable to the naval officers tasked with supporting them. Finch treated the ship's crew, from the seasoned captain down to the junior enlisted sailors, with a polite but profound condescension. They were merely operators, hands to turn wrenches if he ever deigned to tell them which wrench to turn. He saw their practical experience as anecdotal, their observations as irrelevant noise in his pristine data sets. When the ship's chief engineer, a man with 25 years of at-sea experience, suggested a possible issue with the primary coolant circulation, Finch had waved him off dismissively. "We've run the thermal dynamics 1,000 times, Chief," he'd said, not even bothering to make eye contact. "The simulations are perfect. This is a quantum-level cascade, not a leaky radiator." The chief, silenced and humiliated, retreated, taking with him decades of invaluable, tacit knowledge that Finch had deemed worthless. The pressure from Omni Defense, Finch's corporate parent, was mounting. The Intrepid project was their flagship contract, worth hundreds of billions over its lifetime. The daily cost of the stalled ship, both in financial and reputational terms, was staggering. Finch's initial arrogance began to curdle into a brittle, defensive anger. The failure was impossible, therefore it wasn't his fault. It had to be naval incompetence, a solar flare, some unpredicted variable outside the perfect confines of his design. The escalating tension aboard the Intrepid was a microcosm of a larger philosophical battle within the modern military. The struggle between the theorists and the practitioners, between the digital model and the physical reality. The ship was a marvel of automated systems and predictive algorithms, designed to minimize human error. Yet, here it was, defeated by a problem its own creators could not comprehend. The sailors who had once walked the decks with a swagger, proud of serving on the Navy's most advanced vessel, now moved with a quiet listlessness. Their magnificent ship had become a prison, their pride replaced by a creeping dread. They watched Finch and his team, the so-called wizards, with a growing resentment, seeing them not as saviors but as arrogant academics who couldn't find their way out of a paper bag without a GPS. When the news of Admiral Hayes's decision trickled down to the ship, it was met with a stunned disbelief. The name Marcus Thorne was a whisper from a bygone era, a legend to the older generation of non-commissioned officers. To Finch and his team, the name meant nothing. When the Admiral informed Finch directly via a tense video conference that a retired Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant was being flown in to consult, Finch laughed. It was a short, sharp, incredulous bark. "Admiral," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "with all due respect, what you need is a team of particle physicists, which you have. What you're sending me is a garage mechanic. This is a waste of everyone's time." Admiral Hayes's face on the screen was a granite mask. "Your time, Doctor, has yielded nothing. The mechanic is on his way." The line went dead, leaving Finch fuming in the silent war room. The very idea was an insult of the highest order. He, Alastair Finch, the man who had redefined naval propulsion, was being second-guessed by a fossil, a relic from the age of steam and grease. He resolved to make this Master Sergeant's visit as short and humiliating as possible. He would prove, once and for all, that the future belonged to men like him, men of the mind, not men of the wrench. Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, retired, was not a man who sought the world's attention. He lived in a small, meticulously organized bungalow in the misty foothills of the Olympic Mountains, a place where the scent of pine and damp earth was a constant companion. His life was one of quiet routine and deliberate purpose. He spent his days restoring vintage motorcycles, machines of beautiful, tangible simplicity. Every gear, every piston, every polished piece of chrome was a celebration of mechanical honesty, a stark contrast to the opaque, black box technologies of the modern world. Thorne was a man forged in the crucible of the Marine Corps. He had served for 30 years, rising to the highest enlisted rank, a journey that had taken him from the engine rooms of amphibious assault ships to the dusty, improvised workshops of Iraq and Afghanistan. He was a legend in the enlisted ranks, a gunny who could coax a dead generator back to life with a roll of duct tape and a well-aimed kick, a man who could diagnose a failing transmission by the pitch of its whine. His hands, calloused and scarred, were like living sensors, capable of detecting vibrations and temperature shifts that the most sensitive electronic equipment would miss. He possessed an intuitive, almost mystical connection to machinery. He didn't just fix things, he understood them, he listened to them, he felt their language of stress and strain. Admiral Hayes knew Thorne from his time as a young commander in the Persian Gulf. Hayes's destroyer had suffered a catastrophic failure of its main reduction gear, deep in hostile waters. The ship's own engineers and a fly-in team of corporate contractors had declared it unfixable at sea, recommending a risky, week-long tow back to port. Thorne, then a gunnery sergeant on a nearby vessel, had been loaned to Hayes's command. He had spent 2 days in the sweltering, deafening engine room, armed with little more than a set of hand tools and an uncanny patience. He had diagnosed the problem, a hairline fracture in a single gear tooth, missed by every diagnostic, and then orchestrated a brilliant, unorthodox repair using salvaged materials and sheer mechanical genius. He had saved the ship, and Hayes had never forgotten the quiet, confident authority of the man who seemed to see the soul in the machine. When the call from the Admiral's aide came, Thorne was in his workshop, carefully calibrating the carburetor of a 1968 Triumph Bonneville. He listened to the frantic explanation without a word, his expression unreadable. A modern warship dead in the water. A quantum engine. The world's top experts, stumped. He was retired. He had no obligation. He could have simply said no. But as the aide spoke, Thorne felt a familiar stirring, a deep, resonant pull he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about patriotism or duty, not in the simple sense. It was the call of the puzzle, the challenge of a machine that had defied its own creators. It was an affront to the very order of the mechanical universe that a machine could be so complex it was no longer understandable. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "What's the nearest naval air station?" he asked. 2 hours later, a Navy helicopter was descending toward a small clearing near his home. Thorne emerged from his bungalow not in a uniform, but in a simple flannel shirt, worn jeans, and sturdy work boots. He carried no luggage, only a single, heavy leather satchel, its surface softened and darkened with age. It contained not a laptop or a tablet, but a curated collection of hand tools, wrenches polished smooth by decades of use, custom-ground screwdrivers, a perfectly balanced ball-peen hammer. Each tool was an extension of his own hands, a familiar weight that connected him to a lifetime of problem-solving. As he boarded the helicopter, leaving the scent of pine for the sterile, recycled air of the military transport, he felt a sense of profound clarity. He was heading into a world that no longer valued his skills, a world of simulations and black boxes. He was an analog man in a digital age, a relic being summoned to confront a ghost. And he had never felt more alive. The journey to the USS Intrepid was a disorienting trip through the layers of modern military logistics. From the helicopter to a long-range transport jet, and finally to a carrier onboard delivery aircraft that made a jarring, tailhook landing on the deck of a nearby aircraft carrier. From there, it was a final quiet helicopter ride to the deck of the silent, waiting Intrepid. As Marcus Thorne stepped onto the flight deck, he was a figure out of time. The deck buzzed with a nervous, high-tech energy. Sailors in digital camouflage uniforms hurried past, speaking into sophisticated communication headsets. Drones hovered silently, conducting external scans. And in the middle of it all stood Thorn, a gray-haired man in a flannel shirt, his weathered face a stark contrast to the fresh-faced, anxious crew members. His presence was a quiet, analog disruption in a digital world. Dr. Alistair Finch and two of his young protégés met him at the edge of the flight deck. Finch, looking crisp and immaculate despite the sea air, extended a hand, his smile a thin, dismissive veneer. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Thorn, I'm Dr. Finch. Welcome to the Puzzle Palace." The name Puzzle Palace was a piece of internal jargon, meant to be both self-aggrandizing and exclusionary. Thorn simply nodded, his grip firm but brief. He did not offer a smile in return. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were not focused on Finch, but were scanning the ship, taking in the subtle details. The slight list to port, the tension in the lines of the sailors, the unnatural silence where there should have been the low, thrumming heartbeat of a living vessel. "Let's see the patient," Thorn said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly swallowed by the wind. The walk to the engine room was a study in contrasts. Finch and his team strode ahead, pointing out features of the ship with a proprietary air, their conversation peppered with acronyms and technical terms. Thorn followed a few paces behind, his gait unhurried. He wasn't listening to Finch's lecture. He was absorbing the atmosphere of the ship. He ran a hand along a bulkhead, his fingertips registering a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a dissonance that hinted at a deeper malaise. The engine room itself was a cathedral of failure. It was vast, sterile, and eerily beautiful. Instead of the familiar tangle of pipes and gauges of a traditional engine, the Intrepid's propulsion system was a series of sleek, black monoliths, connected by thick, glowing conduits. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and chilled electronics. The only light came from the cold, blue glow of the monoliths and the blinking red error messages on dozens of monitors. It was less an engine room and more a laboratory or a tomb. Finch, now in his element, launched into a complex, condescending explanation of the system's quantum tumbling drive coils and its heuristic control AI. He gestured towards a massive holographic display showing a rotating, three-dimensional model of the engine, highlighting the areas where their simulations had failed. "As you can see," Finch said, a note of smug superiority in his voice, "this is not a matter of a loose bolt or a faulty wire. We are dealing with a systemic cascade failure at the subatomic level, likely triggered by an unforeseen recursive loop in the control software." Thorn didn't even glance at the hologram. His attention was elsewhere. He was watching the junior sailors who stood at the periphery of the room, the ones tasked with monitoring the silent consoles. He saw the fatigue in their eyes, the slump of their shoulders. He walked away from Finch mid-sentence and approached a young petty officer who looked no older than 20. "What did it sound like when it died?" Thorn asked, his voice quiet. The young sailor, startled to be addressed directly, blinked. "Sound like master guns?" It didn't really make a sound. It just stopped. But for a few days before, there was a hum. A hum. Finch interjected, striding over, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Petty officer, we have been over this." The acoustical sensors registered nothing outside of standard operational parameters. The young sailor flinched under Finch's glare, but Thorn held his gaze, a look of quiet encouragement in his eyes. "Tell me about the hum, son," Thorn said gently. "Was a high hum? A low hum?" The sailor swallowed, finding a sudden courage. "It was low master guns. And it felt weird. In my teeth. You know." Thorn nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had his first clue. It wasn't on a screen. It wasn't in a simulation. It was in the teeth of a 20-year-old sailor, a piece of human sensory data that the world's most brilliant physicist had dismissed as irrelevant. The battle lines were drawn. For the rest of that first day, Marcus Thorn did not touch a single tool. He did not open his worn leather satchel. He became a ghost in the machine, a silent, observant presence in the vast, sterile compartments of the USS Intrepid. While Dr. Finch and his team remained cloistered in their war room, debating quantum states and running another series of fruitless simulations, Thorne embarked on a methodical pilgrimage through the heart of the ship. He started in the engine room, but not at the main consoles. He went to the auxiliary spaces, the forgotten corners of the massive compartment. He placed a bare hand on the cold steel of the primary coolant pipes, closing his eyes, feeling for a memory of heat, a ghost of flow. He moved with a slow, deliberate patience that seemed to drive Finch's young acolytes, who were assigned to assist him, to distraction. They would offer him tablets with technical readouts, and he would politely wave them away. "A machine talks to you in its own language," he told one of them. "You have to be quiet enough to hear it." His methods were maddeningly analog. He didn't trust the digital sensors. He trusted his own. He ran his fingers along seams and welds, looking for minute signs of stress. He used a simple mechanic's stethoscope, an ancient tool, to listen to the silent conduits, pressing it against the cold metal as if trying to hear a long-dead heartbeat. To Finch's team, it was the bizarre ritual of a primitive, a man performing voodoo on a supercomputer. They reported back to Finch with barely concealed smirks, describing how the old-timer was tapping on pipes. Finch, in turn, grew more confident that this whole exercise was a farce, a final, foolish gesture by a desperate admiral. Thorne's most crucial time was spent not with the officers or the engineers, but with the enlisted crew. He sought out the sailors who had been on watch when the engine failed, the ones who had lived with it day in and day out. He didn't ask them for technical data. He sat with them in the mess hall over a cup of lukewarm coffee, and he listened. He asked them simple, human questions. Did the lights flicker? Did you smell anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the failure? Where did you feel that hum you mentioned? Just in your teeth? Or in the deck plates, too? He gathered a mosaic of sensory details, a collection of human observations that had been systematically ignored by Finch's data-driven investigation. The sailors, initially wary, began to open up to this quiet, respectful man who valued their input. They told him about the subtle, intermittent vibration that had become a running joke on the lower decks. They mentioned a faint, metallic odor that would occasionally vent from the environmental systems, an odor the ship's chemical sensors had dismissed as a calibration anomaly. They were painting a picture for him, one of a machine that had been quietly crying for help for weeks. Only no one with the authority to listen had understood the language it was speaking. By the end of the day, Thorne had a map in his mind, a map not of the engine's electronic circuits, but of its physical soul. He had traced the path of the strange hum, the source of the faint odor, the epicenter of the vibration. It all led back to one place, a deeply unglamorous and overlooked part of the system, the primary gyroscopic stabilizer, a massive, spinning flywheel encased deep within the ship's keel, designed to keep the vessel perfectly balanced. According to Finch's design, the stabilizer was a perfectly closed system, self-lubricating, self-balancing, and requiring no maintenance for 20 years. It was so reliable, so fundamental, that it wasn't even included in the active diagnostic loops. It was assumed to be perfect. As Thorne stood on the deck directly above the stabilizer's housing, he could feel it, even in its inert state, a faint, residual wrongness in the very steel of the ship. A dissonance. It was the same feeling he'd had touching the bulkhead when he first came aboard. The puzzle pieces were beginning to click into place. The failure wasn't in the glamorous, quantum-level brain of the engine. It was in the simple, mechanical heart that everyone, especially its creator, had taken for granted. The next morning, Thorne requested a meeting with Admiral Hayes via secure video link. He insisted that Dr. Finch be present. The mood in the Intrepid's war room was tense. Finch, flanked by his team, stood with his arms crossed, an expression of supreme boredom on his face. He viewed this as a formality, a final, necessary step before the Admiral would be forced to admit his folly and send the mechanic home. Thorne did not bring charts or graphs. He simply stood before the camera, his posture calm, his hands clasped behind his back. "Admiral," he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I believe I have identified the source of the failure." A collective, almost imperceptible scoff went through Finch's team. Finch himself allowed a small, condescending smile to play on his lips. "Do enlighten us, Master Gunnery Sergeant," Finch said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Have you discovered a gremlin in the machine?" Thorne ignored him, his gaze fixed on the Admiral's face on the screen. "Sir, the problem isn't in the propulsion system software, nor is it a failure of the drive coils. The engine shut itself down. It was a preemptive safety protocol. Impossible snaped. All safety protocols are logged. There are no such logs. The system suffered a catastrophic, uncommanded shutdown. The system that failed isn't the one you've been looking at," Thorne continued, his voice unwavering. "For the past 17 days, you've been performing an autopsy on a patient who died of a heart attack, but you've only been examining the brain. The failure is in the primary gyroscopic stabilizer." The room fell silent. Finch's smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. "The stabilizer? That's absurd. The Gyro is a closed mechanical system. It's designed to be flawless. It has no direct interface with the propulsion control AI that could trigger a shutdown of this nature." "It has an indirect interface," Thorne countered. "It has a vibration sensor, a simple, analog piece of hardware designed to trigger an emergency shutdown if the flywheel experiences a catastrophic imbalance. You designed a system so smart, it could predict its own structural failure and kill the power to prevent the ship from tearing itself apart." Finch stared, his mind racing. "The vibration sensors would have sent a signal. There's no record." "There's no record," Thorne cut him off, his voice hardening slightly, "because the signal was misinterpreted. Your AI is designed to look for digital data streams. A simple, continuous analog voltage signal from a legacy sensor. It probably flagged it as a sensor malfunction, a piece of junk data, right before it executed the shutdown command it was given. You've been searching for a complex ghost in the machine, Doctor. The problem is far simpler. It's mechanical." He then laid out his evidence. The low-frequency hum felt by the crew, a classic symptom of a bearing failure in a large flywheel. The faint metallic odor, likely the smell of atomized, superheated lubricant from that same failing bearing. The timeline, the gradual escalation of symptoms, it all pointed to a slow, grinding mechanical death. "The simulations didn't predict it," Thorne concluded, "because your simulations assumed a perfect mechanical system. They didn't account for a single, faulty ball bearing in a 10-ton flywheel, a tiny flaw in a piece of steel forged 1,000 miles from your laboratory." The color drained from Finch's face. The logic was simple, elegant, and terrifyingly plausible. It bypassed all his complex theories and pointed to a single, embarrassing point of failure. A piece of basic, first-year mechanical engineering. That's a preposterous leap of logic," Finch stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "You have no proof." "You're right, I don't," Thorne said. "But I can get it. Admiral, I need your permission to do something Dr. Finch's team has not. I need to get my hands dirty. I need you to authorize me to manually override the access hatches on the stabilizer housing and inspect it. Physically." Admiral Hayes, who had listened to the entire exchange in silence, his expression unreadable, made his decision. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice firm, "you and your team have had 17 days. Master Sergeant Thorne has had one. Permission granted. You have 24 hours, Gunny. Find me your proof." The feed cut out, leaving a stunned and humiliated Alistair Finch in a room that suddenly felt very cold. The old man hadn't just presented a theory. He had exposed the fatal blind spot in Finch's entire worldview, a failure to respect the simple, brutal, physical reality of the machine. The order from Admiral Hayes sent a shockwave of activity through the ship. The deep, previously inaccessible levels of the ship where the gyroscopic stabilizer was housed were unsealed for the first time since the Intrepid's launch. The air that hissed out was stale and smelled faintly of hot metal, the very scent the sailors had reported. For Dr. Finch, this was the ultimate indignity. His pristine, theoretical world was being literally pried open by a man with a wrench. He and his team watched from a railed observation deck overlooking the access hatch, their faces a mixture of scorn and morbid curiosity. They were scientists at a public dissection, confident the surgeon was a quack. Thorne, however, was in his element. He stripped off his flannel shirt, revealing a simple gray t-shirt and arms corded with the lean, hard muscle of a lifetime of physical work. He opened his old leather satchel, and the quiet, metallic click of his tools being laid out on a clean cloth was the first sound of real work the engine room had heard in weeks. He didn't ask for any of Finch's team. Instead, he handpicked a small crew of 4 young sailors, the very ones he had spoken to in the mess hall, the ones who had described the hum and the smell. He chose them not for their technical knowledge, but for their attentiveness and their nascent, intuitive respect for the machine. "We're going in," Thorne said simply, his voice calm and authoritative. "Stay alert. Trust your senses. If something feels wrong, smells wrong, or sounds wrong, you tell me." The massive, circular hatch to the stabilizer housing was a masterpiece of engineering, held in place by dozens of high-tensile bolts. The ship's schematics called for a specialized robotic arm to open it. The arm, of course, was powered by the main engine. It was useless. "No power," one of the sailors said, stating the obvious. "We'll never get this open." Thorne didn't answer. He picked up a massive, custom-forged wrench from his kit, its surface worn smooth with use. He handed another to the biggest of the young sailors. "We'll do it the old way," he said, one bolt at a time. For the next 4 hours, they worked in a rhythmic, coordinated ballet of muscle and steel. The air was filled with the sharp, percussive clang of wrenches on bolts, the grunts of exertion, the quiet words of encouragement from Thorne. It was hard, grueling physical labor. Up on the observation deck, Finch watched with a contemptuous sneer. "Primitive," he muttered to one of his protégés. "Absolutely medieval." But on the deck below, something was happening. The young sailors, who had been listless and demoralized for weeks, were transformed. They were no longer passive observers of a problem. They were active participants in its solution. Working alongside this quiet, confident master sergeant, they felt a sense of purpose, a connection to the ship they hadn't felt before. They were, for the first time, fighting back against the silence. Finally, with a deep groan of protesting metal, the last bolt came free. Using a series of manual chain hoists, they slowly lifted the massive hatch. A wave of superheated, acrid air washed over them. It was the smell Thorne had been searching for. Donning heat-resistant gear and breathing apparatus, Thorne was the first one to descend into the housing. The interior was a cavern of spinning machinery, or what should have been. The 10-ton flywheel was motionless. Using powerful work lights, Thorne began his inspection. It took him less than 10 minutes. He ran a gloved hand over the surface of the main axle bearing, a massive ring of polished steel. His fingers came away with a fine metallic dust. He pointed his light into the bearing assembly itself. And there it was, the proof. A series of deep, gouged scores scarred the inside of the bearing race. At the bottom of the housing, a small pile of shimmering metal shavings and a single, fractured, misshapen piece of steel, what was left of a ball bearing that had disintegrated under immense heat and pressure. It was a catastrophic mechanical failure, simple, brutal, and undeniable. "Give me a camera," Thorne's voice, muffled by the respirator, echoed up from the housing. "Dr. Finch is going to want to see this." A young sailor scrambled to lower a fiber optic camera. The image that appeared on the monitor on the observation deck was crystal clear. The mangled bearing, the metal dust, the undeniable evidence of a physical, not a digital, death. A profound, tomb-like silence fell over Finch and his team. There were no equations, no simulations, no quantum theories that could explain this away. It was a picture of a broken piece of metal. It was a failure of a kind they had never even considered. The old man had been right. The mechanic had found the problem that had baffled the physicists. The primitive had triumphed over the profound. And in that moment, Alistair Finch's world, built on the unshakable foundation of his own intellect, shattered into a million pieces. The discovery sent a jolt through the entire ship. The image of the failed bearing was transmitted directly to Admiral Hayes at the Pentagon, a silent, irrefutable vindication of his gamble. On the observation deck, Dr. Finch stood as if turned to stone, his face a pale mask of disbelief and abject humiliation. His entire theory, his 17 days of brilliant, sophisticated work, had been rendered irrelevant by a single, broken piece of steel. His complex symphony had been silenced by the mechanical equivalent of a snapped violin string. Thorne and his team emerged from the stabilizer housing, their faces streaked with grease and sweat, looking like miners emerging from a deep, dark pit. They were exhausted, but their eyes shone with the bright, fierce light of triumph. The young sailors stood a little taller, their movements filled with a newfound confidence. They had not just witnessed a solution, they had helped create it. A faulty bearing. Admiral Hayes's voice crackled over the ship's intercom, patched into the engine room. "That's it, Gunny? After all this?" "That's it, Admiral," Thorne confirmed, his voice weary but steady. It started to go, created a micro-vibration. Over time, that vibration threw the flywheel out of balance. The AI was smart enough to know the vibration was a precursor to the whole assembly tearing itself apart at 10,000 RPMs. So it did its job. It shut everything down to save the ship. The only thing it wasn't programmed to do was to send a text message saying, "Hey, the bearing is shot." The elegant simplicity of it was devastating. Now came the harder question. "Can you fix it, Gunny?" the Admiral asked, a note of raw hope in his voice. Finch, snapping out of his stupor, finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Fix it, Admiral. That's a custom-forged, cryo-treated bearing assembly. We don't have a spare. It will take 6 months to manufacture a new one at the factory. You'll have to tow the ship back to port." It was an admission of defeat, but also a final attempt to reassert his authority, to frame the problem once again in terms of his own complex, industrial world. Thorne wiped a smear of grease from his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked at the massive, inert flywheel. Then he looked at his small, hand-picked team of sailors. "We're not in a factory, Doctor," Thorne said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're on a warship. We don't have 6 months. Admiral, I can get the ship moving, but it won't be pretty." What followed was a masterclass in improvisation and pure, unadulterated mechanical genius. The failed bearing was beyond repair, but Thorne's plan was not to fix it, but to bypass it. Using the ship's small, onboard machine shop, a space Finch had dismissed as a relic, Thorne and his team began to fabricate a new solution from scratch. They didn't have the exotic alloys of the original design, but they had raw steel stock, a lathe, and a milling machine. Thorne, using a piece of chalk on a steel plate, sketched out a design for a temporary, custom-built friction bearing, a simpler, more robust technology that hadn't been used in naval engineering for 50 years. It was an elegant, almost brutally simple solution. It wouldn't be as efficient, it wouldn't be as quiet, but it would work. It would hold. For the next 12 hours, the machine shop, long silent, whirred and buzzed with activity. Thorne directed his young team with a calm, focused intensity, teaching them, guiding their hands, transforming them from passive monitors into active creators. They cut, they milled, they welded. They were not just following orders. They were learning a forgotten art. Finch watched the entire process from a distance, a silent, haunted observer. He saw Thorne using calipers and micrometers with a precision that rivaled his own laser scanners. He saw the elegant, intuitive mathematics taking place not on a whiteboard, but in the mind of a man shaping raw steel. He was witnessing a form of intelligence, a form of creation that his entire education had taught him to dismiss as inferior. It was a humbling, soul-crushing education. Finally, the new, custom-fabricated bearing was complete. It was not as sleek or polished as the original, but it was a thing of raw, functional beauty. With immense effort, they installed it, their movements sure and practiced. "All right," Thorne said, stepping back, his work complete. "Let's see if the old ways still work." He bypassed the automated startup sequence, routing the controls to a manual panel. He looked at the young petty officer who had first told him about the hum. "You have the honors, son." With a trembling hand, the sailor engaged the primary power. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low rumble began, a deep, resonant vibration that was not a sign of failure, but of life. The massive flywheel began to turn, slowly at first, then gaining speed. The hum grew, not the high-pitched whine of a machine in distress, but the deep, powerful thrum of a healthy, beating heart. The lights in the engine room flickered, then burned steady and bright. A cheer erupted from the assembled crew, a raw, explosive sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The ghost ship was a ghost no more. It was alive, and it had been resurrected not by a physicist, but by a mechanic who understood that sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest, most elegant, and most human solutions. The resurrection of a USS Intrepid sent ripples far beyond its own hull. The news that a retired Marine had succeeded where a multi-million-dollar team of corporate experts had failed was a story too compelling, too symbolic, to remain classified for long. It became a legend, first whispered in the mess halls and corridors of the Pentagon, then leaked to the press, where it exploded into a national narrative. Marcus Thorne was hailed as a hero, an embodiment of old-school American ingenuity. He was the quiet, competent man who had tamed the technological beast. Dr. Alastair Finch and Omni Defense, on the other hand, became symbols of corporate arrogance and over-reliance on flawed, theoretical models. The fallout was swift and severe. Omni Defense stock plummeted. The Pentagon launched a full-scale investigation into the Intrepid project, freezing billions of dollars in future contracts. Finch was quietly, unceremoniously removed as the lead of the program, his career as the golden boy of the defense industry effectively over. He was reassigned to a dreary, windowless office to review legacy systems, a humiliating exile for a man who had once considered himself the architect of the future. The Navy, under Admiral Hayes's now unassailable leadership, underwent a period of profound introspection. The Intrepid incident had exposed a deep, systemic vulnerability, a dangerous disconnect between the designers of their advanced systems and the people who actually operated them. In response, Admiral Hayes launched the Thorne Initiative, a revolutionary new program designed to bridge this gap. The initiative mandated that veteran, senior enlisted personnel, the master gunnery sergeants, the master chief petty officers, be embedded in the design and testing phases of all new major naval systems. It created new training programs that emphasized fundamental mechanical and engineering principles alongside high-tech systems management. It was a cultural shift, a deliberate move to reinfuse the Navy with the practical, hands-on wisdom that had been marginalized in the race for technological supremacy. Marcus Thorne himself wanted none of the accolades. He politely but firmly declined offers of lucrative consulting contract from rival defense companies, a presidential citation, and a book deal. The moment the Intrepid was safely underway, its engine purring with the steady, reliable rhythm of his own handiwork, he had simply packed his worn leather satchel, shaken the Admiral's hand, and taken the first available transport back to the quiet mist of the Olympic Mountains. His mission was complete. He returned to his workshop, to the familiar comfort of his vintage motorcycles, the scent of pine and oil replacing the sterile ozone of the warship. He had not sought fame or fortune. He had answered the call of the puzzle, a machine that needed understanding. The truest reward, for him, was the simple, satisfying hum of a well-running engine. His legacy, however, was now cemented in naval history. He became a larger-than-life figure, a gunny, who represented the timeless value of experience, the power of intuition, and the profound wisdom that can only be earned through a lifetime of getting one's hands dirty. The story of how he listened to the ship, how he trusted the sailors, and how he forged a solution from raw steel became required reading at the Naval Academy. The young sailors he had mentored on the Intrepid went on to have distinguished careers, each of them carrying the lessons he had imparted. They learned to listen to their machines, to trust their senses, and to never be intimidated by a problem, no matter how complex it seemed. They were Thorne's living legacy, spreading his philosophy throughout the fleet. The USS Intrepid itself continued to serve a potent symbol of American naval power, but it was now a different kind of symbol. It was a testament not just to technological achievement, but to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. It was a reminder that the most advanced systems are only as good as the people who operate and maintain them, and that sometimes the most critical component isn't a microchip or a quantum coil, but the quiet, irreplaceable wisdom of a master craftsman. The tale of the USS Intrepid and Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne became more than just a naval legend. It evolved into a powerful, enduring parable for the modern age. It served as a stark, cautionary tale about the perils of hubris, particularly the intellectual arrogance that often accompanies rapid technological advancement. Dr. Alastair Finch and his team, with all their brilliance and pedigrees, were blinded by their own certitude. They believed so completely in the perfection of their digital models and simulations that they became incapable of seeing a simple, physical truth right in front of them. Their failure was a powerful reminder that data, without context and human interpretation, can be a form of blindness. They had terabytes of information, but zero understanding. The story championed the timeless, often undervalued, virtue of practical experience. Marcus Thorne represented a different kind of intelligence, not the kind learned in a lecture hall, but the kind earned in the grime and heat of an engine room, etched into the calluses of his hands and the keenness of his senses. His wisdom was tactile, intuitive, and holistic. He didn't just analyze a machine's components. He understood its interconnectedness, its personality, its soul. He was a testament to the fact that true mastery comes from a deep, symbiotic relationship with one's craft, a relationship that cannot be simulated or outsourced to an algorithm. His triumph was a validation for every skilled technician, every seasoned craftsman, every experienced practitioner who has ever been dismissed or condescended to by a younger, more credentialed but less experienced superior. It was a resounding declaration that years of hands-on, problem-solving experience constitute a form of expertise as valid and as powerful as any doctoral degree. The narrative also highlighted a critical lesson in leadership. Admiral Hayes's decision to bring in Thorne was a profound act of courage and humility. He had the wisdom to recognize the limits of the conventional approach and the courage to trust his gut, betting his career on a person rather than a protocol. It underscored the idea that a true leader's strength lies not in having all the answers, but in knowing where to find them, often in the most unexpected of places. Furthermore, the story served as a powerful metaphor for listening. Finch and his team were deaf to the machine's true language. They filtered out the noise, the sailors' anecdotal reports, the low-frequency hum, the faint smells, because it didn't fit their preconceived diagnostic models. Thorne, in contrast, started by listening. He listened to the sailors, he listened to the silent steel, he listened to the subtle environmental cues. He succeeded because he believed that the problem itself would tell him how to solve it, if only he was quiet and attentive enough to hear its story. In a world increasingly dominated by black box technologies, artificial intelligence, and complex systems that few truly understand, the story of the Intrepid is a call to remember the fundamentals. It is a reminder that every complex system, no matter how sophisticated, ultimately rests on a foundation of simple, physical principles. To lose touch with those principles, to place all our faith in the opaque workings of our own creations, is to court disaster. Marcus Thorne's legacy, therefore, was not just the saving of a ship. It was the restoration of a vital balance, a balance between the theoretical and the practical, the digital and the analog, the complex model and the simple, observable truth. It was a timeless lesson that the human element, with its intuition, its sensory experience, and its hard-won wisdom, is not a system flaw to be minimized, but the most powerful and adaptable problem-solving tool ever created. The quiet hum of the Intrepid's resurrected engine was a testament to that enduring, irreplaceable human genius.